Most ghost towns took decades to die. A mine thinned out, a railroad rerouted, a company slowly walked away over 20 or 30 years. That is not what happened in the American West. Some of these towns hit 10,000 people in 18 months and dropped to zero within 5 years. One was built, boomed, and completely emptied out faster than it takes most towns today to get a single shopping center approved. These aren't slow declines. These are boom and bust towns where the bust took less time than the boom did. 14 towns. All of them moved at the speed of gold. Here's the thing that makes gold rush ghost towns different from almost everything else on this channel. A coal town or a timber town was usually built by a company that did the math first, surveyed the resource, estimated how long it would last, then built infrastructure to match the estimate. Gold rush towns skipped that step entirely. They were built on rumor, speed, and the fear of missing out. Word of a strike would hit a newspaper, and within months a tent camp would become a town with a bank, a saloon, and a newspaper of its own, built by people betting on a resource nobody had actually surveyed yet. Investors in San Francisco or New York would commit real capital based on a single optimistic assay report, sight unseen, because waiting to verify the claim meant losing the claim to someone else first. Which means the bust, when it came, was never a slow economic transition the way it was for a planned coal camp. It was finding out, all at once, that the rumor ran out faster than the buildings did. Gold was discovered in this stretch of the Nevada desert in 1904, and within 4 years Rhyolite had somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 residents, a stock exchange, an opera house, electric lighting, and a 3-story bank building constructed from concrete poured to look like cut stone. Investors poured capital in based on early assay reports that turned out to be wildly optimistic about how much gold the ground actually held. By 1910, the richest ore was already exhausted, and the bank that had financed half the town's growth collapsed. The 1911 financial panic finished the job. By 1920, the census recorded a population of fewer than 20 people. Today, the bank building's ruins are one of the most photographed ghost town structures in the country. 3 stories of concrete poured to look permanent, standing in a desert that swallowed a stock exchange in under 15 years. Bodie's strike in 1859 stayed modest for 2 decades until a 1876 cave-in exposed a major gold vein, triggering a rush that brought the population to roughly 10,000 by 1880, complete with 65 saloons and a murder rate locals at the time described as nearly daily. Boomtown lawlessness here wasn't an exaggeration for effect. It was a documented operating condition of the town, to the point that a young girl moving there with her family was said to have prayed, "Goodbye God, I'm going to Bodie." As accessible gold thinned through the wilds in 1880s, residents left in waves rather than all at once, but the speed of decline still outpaced almost any standard industrial ghost town. By the early 1940s, the post office closed for good. California's state park system later preserved what remained in a condition they call arrested decay. Nothing restored, nothing allowed to collapse further, frozen at the exact midpoint between standing and gone. Rangers maintaining the site have reported that visitors who pocket small relics from the ground often mail them back years later, convinced the items brought them bad luck. Founded in 1881 after a major silver strike in the Mojave Desert, Calico grew to roughly 200 residents and more than 500 mines within its first few productive years, fueled by silver rather than gold but following the identical boom-bust pattern. The Silver Purchase Act repeal in 1893 collapsed silver prices nationally almost overnight, and Calico's entire economic foundation went with it within a matter of months. Unlike most entries on this list, Calico got a second act. Walter Knott of Knott's Berry Farm purchased and restored much of the town starting in the 1950s, turning it into one of the most visited historic mining towns in California today. That makes Calico the rare ghost town on this list that didn't stay a ghost town. It became a tourist reconstruction of itself, preserved not by accident but by a theme park fortune that decided the ruins were worth saving. Built in 1880 along a Colorado Rocky Mountain rail line to serve over 150 mining claims in the surrounding mountains, St. Elmo briefly supported around 2,000 residents, 5 hotels, and a telegraph office at an elevation over 9,000 feet, where winters routinely buried the town in snow for months at a time. The mining economy here held on longer than most entries on this list, surviving into the early 20th century before the rail line itself was abandoned in 1922. cutting the town off from the supply chain it depended on to survive. What makes St. Elmo unusual is preservation quality. Dozens of original wooden buildings remain standing along the main street, largely intact, making it one of the best preserved unrestored ghost towns in Colorado. Locals have long told stories of a remaining resident, a woman named Annabelle Stark, who reportedly stayed in town alone for decades after nearly everyone else left, refusing every offer to sell her family's general store. This one isn't gold, it's copper, and it's a different kind of speed story entirely. The Kennecott Copper Corporation discovered an extraordinarily rich copper deposit in Alaska's Wrangell Mountains in 1900, and by 1911 had built an entire company town and processing mill in genuinely remote wilderness, accessible only by a rail line built specifically to serve the operation, at a cost that would be enormous even by today's standards. The ore ran out faster than almost anyone expected for a deposit that rich. By 1938, the company simply shut the entire operation down and left, abandoning not just housing but the full industrial mill complex itself, a 14-story wooden structure clinging to a mountainside, with machinery left in place because shipping it back out cost more than it was worth. Today it sits inside Wrangell St. Elias National Park, the largest national park in the country, and is recognized as one of the most intact abandoned copper processing complexes in the world. Named for the semi-precious stone occasionally found alongside the gold here, garnet boomed after an 1895 strike and reached roughly 1,000 residents within a few years, supporting 4 hotels, 13 saloons, and a population that, by most accounts, badly outpaced the actual size of the gold deposit underneath it. Miners here worked through Montana winters that could drop well below zero, in a town built faster than its infrastructure could really support. A 1912 fire destroyed much of the business district just as the most accessible gold was already running thin, and the combination proved fatal rather than just damaging. There wasn't enough remaining economic reason to rebuild what burned. Montana's Bureau of Land Management now manages the site as a stabilized historic ghost town, with roughly 30 original structures preserved largely as they were left, including a saloon where, by some accounts, a half-finished card game was simply abandoned mid-hand. Shaniko wasn't built on gold at all. It boomed in the early 1900s as a wool shipping rail terminus, briefly billing itself as the wool capital of the world as ranchers across a huge swath of Central Oregon funneled their shipments through its rail depot. At its peak, around 1903, it handled millions of pounds of wool annually through a town of only a few hundred residents, with wagon trains backed up for blocks during peak shipping season. A new rail line built in 1911 bypassed Shaniko entirely, redirecting the wool trade through a competing route, and the town's entire reason for existing disappeared within a single shipping season. Unlike a gradual resource decline, Shaniko's death date is essentially a specific year. The town didn't run out of anything physical at all. The railroad simply stopped needing it, and an entire local economy evaporated because of a decision made in a boardroom somewhere else entirely. Sitting above 11,000 feet in the San Juan Mountains, Animas Forks held roughly 450 residents at its 1880s peak, despite winters so severe that some accounts describe snow-burying buildings to the second story, forcing residents to dig tunnels between structures just to move around town during the worst months of the year. Mining here continued sporadically into the early 1900s, but the combination of extreme elevation, brutal winters, and increasingly marginal ore made year-round habitation progressively less viable, and the town emptied gradually rather than collapsing all at once. What remains today, including the well-preserved Walsh-Duncan House with its distinctive bay window facing straight into the wind, sits at one of the highest elevations of any ghost town in the United States. A town that didn't just lose its industry, it lost a fight with its own geography that it was probably never going to win. Goldfield's 1902 strike triggered one of the largest gold rushes in Nevada history, and by 1906 the town had exploded to somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 residents, briefly making it the largest city in the entire state. Bigger than Reno, bigger than Las Vegas, which at the time barely existed at all. The Goldfield Hotel, built in 1908, was considered one of the most luxurious buildings between Chicago and San Francisco, with electric lights and steam heat in a desert town that had been empty scrubland a decade earlier. Production peaked almost immediately and declined just as fast. By 1910, output had dropped by more than half, and a combination of a catastrophic 1913 flood and a 1923 fire that destroyed most of the remaining business district finished what the declining ore grade had started. Today, fewer than 300 people live in Goldfield, surrounded by the largest collection of early 1900s architecture left standing in rural Nevada, built for a city of 20,000 that lasted less than a decade. Gold discovered along Grasshopper Creek in 1862 made Bannack Montana's first territorial capital, and the town boomed to several thousand residents within months, complete with a level of lawlessness severe enough that the elected sheriff, Henry Plummer, was later hanged by vigilantes after being accused of secretly leading the very outlaw gang he was supposed to be stopping. The capital moved to Virginia City within a few years as richer strikes drew miners elsewhere, and Bannack's population drained steadily through the late 1800s as the gold thinned and the town lost the political prestige that had briefly propped it up alongside the mining economy. Montana state parks now maintain over 60 standing structures, making Bannack one of the most architecturally complete ghost towns in the American West. A capital city abandoned, with the building where the legislature once met still standing empty on the main street. Tucked into the Owehee Mountains of southwestern Idaho, Silver City grew around silver and gold strikes starting in 1863, eventually supporting roughly 75 businesses and 8 working stamp mills at its peak in the 1880s. Processing ore brought down from dozens of surrounding claims scattered across the mountainside. Decline here was slower and stranger than most entries on this list. The town never fully emptied, with a handful of buildings still privately maintained today, but the road in remains an unpaved mountain pass that's impassable for months each winter, meaning Silver City effectively becomes a true ghost town every single year regardless of who technically owns the buildings. It's less a town that died once than a town that quietly dies every November and comes back every June. Alabama's first state capital wasn't a mining town at all. It was a planned government and cotton trading town established in 1820, and its undoing wasn't a played-out resource but repeated catastrophic flooding from its location at the confluence of the Alabama and Cahaba rivers, combined with the capital's relocation to Tuscaloosa in 1826 after one flood, too many embarrassed state legislators trying to reach the Capitol building by boat. What's striking about Cahaba is the timeline. This is one of the only entries on this list that emptied and refilled multiple times, briefly repopulating after the capital moved before the Civil War's economic disruption and continued flooding emptied it again for good by the early 1900s. Today, it's an archaeological site, with most structures long gone. A town erased not by running out of resources, but by a river that simply never agreed the location was viable in the first place. Straddling what residents believed for years was the California-Nevada border, Aurora's 1,860 gold strike grew the town to roughly 5,000 residents within 2 years, including a young Samuel Clemens, who worked a mining claim here briefly before moving on to journalism and, eventually, the pen name Mark Twain. For a short time, Aurora was considered seriously enough as a city that it nearly became a state capital. A government survey in 1863 settled the border dispute and determined Aurora was actually in Nevada, not California. A bureaucratic footnote that mattered less than the gold running out shortly after. And by the 1880s, the town was effectively empty. Unlike most entries on this list, almost nothing structural survives at Aurora today. Decades of scavenging for building materials and brick reduced what was once a 5,000-person boomtown to scattered foundations in open desert, making it one of the most thoroughly erased ghost towns in the American West. Terlingua boomed around cinnabar mining, the ore used to extract mercury, starting in the 1890s, reaching a peak population estimated around 2,000 in the early 1900s, almost entirely dependent on a single company, the Chizos Mining Company, that controlled the mine, the housing, and the local economy completely, in a pattern that should sound familiar from nearly every coal camp this channel has ever covered. When mercury prices collapsed after World War I, demand dried up, and the most accessible cinnabar deposits were exhausted by the 1940s, Terlingua emptied with a speed that mirrors almost every other entry here. Boom-built infrastructure abandoned within a handful of years, the company simply walking away from a town it no longer needed. What makes Terlingua the right place to end on is what happened after. A small population of artists, eccentrics, and off-grid residents slowly resettled the ruins starting in the 1960s and 70s, turning a dead mining town into one of the strangest still-occupied semi-ghost towns in America today, complete with an annual chili cook-off that now draws thousands of visitors to a place that, by every economic measure, should have stayed empty forever. Proof that even the fastest deaths on this list didn't always stay permanent. 14 towns. Some emptied in 18 months. Some took 20 years. All of them moved faster than the slow industrial declines we usually cover on this channel. Because gold, unlike coal, was never something anyone surveyed properly before building a bank, a stock exchange, or a 14-story mill on top of it. If one of these surprised you, tell me which one in the comments, and if you want the full story behind any single town on this list, say the name below, and that's exactly what gets covered next. This is the kind of history that disappears fast and gets remembered slowly. Subscribe if you want to keep finding it before it's gone for good.